All right, everybody. Welcome to room 308 at Hofstra Law School. I have a new background now. And I love to welcome everyone that's on to Civil Rights in the Age of Coronavirus. We are really fortunate to have two terrific lawyer presenters today who I will introduce shortly. We're very grateful for them to taking time out of their very busy schedules to speak with all of us. And we're grateful for all of you who have joined us as well. First, we hope everybody's staying safe. We're all relatively familiar with Zoom at this point. We live in a Zoom world, but let me just talk about some basics before we begin. One, we're asking everybody, please turn off your video. The only videos that we want to have on are the three of us who are presenting, so please do that. You're all muted by Andrew Berman, and so we're not going to have people speak. If you have a question that you want us to ask, please put it in the chat room. You all know where the chat room is. Well, for those of you who don't, on the bottom of your screen in the middle, there's something called chat. Excuse me, if you pull that up, you can ask a question. What we intend to do is we're going to have a conversation among the three of us until about 1 o'clock. And then we will take your questions for the remaining time, which is until 1:30. I might intersperse some of the questions you ask between 12:10 and between now and 1 o'clock. So feel free to put your questions up now, okay? Before I introduce the speakers and go forward, let me just first thank many people. First of all, this is sponsored by the Freedman Institute for the Study of Legal Ethics. I direct that institute, and Debbie Grattan, who is the administrator for the institute, has helped put this together. I particularly want to thank Andrew Berman and his staff, the communications people at Hofstra, without whom we wouldn't be able to have this program. This program is sponsored by a wide range of student organizations, including our Freedman Justice Fellows, many of whom are on today, the Black Law Students Association, the Latinx Law Student Association, Muslim Law Student Association, South Asian Law Student Association, and If, When, How, which is lawyering for reproductive justice. So thank you to all of those people. As we know, life has been upended for all of us with what we do, with who we're with the work that we do, with how we work, with everything about this current era. And that's certainly true for civil rights organizations who until the last month were working diligently on a wide range of issues. But that rapidly shifted. They had to shift gears to deal with the current crisis. And that's what we're going to talk about today. One of those organizations, founded in 1963, is the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Their theme is to secure justice for all, and they work on a wide range of issues from voting rights, housing, economic justice, criminal justice, health, employment, education, etc. I encourage you at some point, but not right now, to look at their website so you can see the work that they're doing and the staff. They have an extensive staff. They engage in legal advocacy, including litigation, to help ensure compliance with laws and help ensure that existing policies do not exacerbate our existing bias, racial inequality, and injustice. So we are so delighted. We have two terrific people. The first person is Dari Ali Rodriguez, who's the director of the Economic Justice Project. She's led the effort to combat discrimination in employment and in healthcare for a long period of time. She's filed a number of significant pieces of litigation, including amicus briefs. And you can find those, if you will, if you want, on the website as well. Before that, she was an Assistant Attorney General at the New York Attorney General's Office in the Civil Rights Division. Prior to that, she was in private practice. She clerked for the New Jersey Superior Court. And for many of you, I'm proud to tell you that she is a Hofstra Law grad. She was a Dwight Green Fellow, and she is also on the board of directors of the Freedman Institute and will join us tonight in a board meeting that we're having. Welcome, Dari Ali. We're really pleased that you could do this. AJ Sani is also with the Lawyers Committee, and he's counsel in the Voting Rights Project, where prior to COVID, he was working on a wide range of issues on census and access to the ballot box, which has really changed significantly as well since we've all been in the COVID world. He too came from the Attorney General's office in the Civil Rights Bureau, engaging in a wide range of litigation, including cases involving DACA, He is a Columbia 2012 law grad, and after that, he went directly to the AG's office. So thank you both so much for being here. I'm going to ask people who have just joined to please turn off your video. And once again, if you just joined, we welcome your questions in the chat room. So how about if we start here? AJ, you were working on a wide range of issues and voting rights before all this happened. So what we'd like to hear from you as a start is, so how did that change, both in terms of what you did and how it was possible to move all of this work online?
Yeah, sure. And just start off the bat, just want to say thanks, Alan, and thanks to Hofstra for having me speak on this webinar, and thanks to everyone for making some time to listen in on this important topic. So yes, things have changed pretty significantly over the past month, which in the voting world, and my job has become extremely has totally changed in character. So, you know, about a month ago, we were focused on a number of issues relating to ballot access, relating all across the country, mostly in anticipation of the upcoming general election in November. We were overseeing doing election protection work for primary elections that were occurring up through Super Tuesday and the week after Super Tuesday. And that generally involves a lot of organizing effort on the ground, making sure that we have our hotline, 866 Our Vote, up and running, making sure we have local partners on the ground who can help troubleshoot issues for voters when they're at their polling place. And then our litigation team was, you know, closely watching these elections to see if there are any issues that come up that affect ballot access that could involve access to early voting. It could be, you know, problems with machines, election ballot marking devices. Of course, that's all changed in the last 4 weeks as state after state have postponed their elections for sometimes weeks, sometimes months. And most states are considering some version of expanding their existing infrastructure for vote by mail. And we in the advocacy community are also sort of thinking through issues relating to vote by mail, and we're trying to figure out, you know, on that issue, how to make it more accessible for voters, what barriers exist for voters to obtain a ballot by mail and obtain an absentee ballot. You know, there are a few states in the country, just about a handful, that conduct more or less their entire election by mail. You know, Oregon being one of them, Colorado, Washington. But the vast majority of states do not. And while there are, you know, I would say about 28 states that allow individuals to obtain ballots without any sort of excuse, there are a lot of states that restrict access to absentee ballots, and that can be, you know, that's posing a particular challenge in this moment as we're trying to make sure that everyone feels safe when they're casting a ballot. In addition, you know, I think there are just administrative hurdles that come into play when you're talking about voting by mail as well. A lot of election administrators will tell you that the existing infrastructure is really geared towards in-person voting in most states. And so changing that up and making sure that you have the staff and resources available to actually make sure that you're conducting an election properly, that's conducted mostly by mail, can be a very arduous task. So these are the kinds of issues that we're starting to think through now. And, you know, the timeline for making sure that these things are in place is fairly short. We, you know, the next primary that's coming up is Ohio's on the 28th. There will be additional primaries all throughout May and June. And obviously we're all looking towards November and thinking about what needs to happen before then. You know, just to answer the other part of your question, Alan, the election protection work that Lawyers Committee does is central to making sure that we're effective in protecting access to the ballot. And as you can imagine, that work has become exceedingly difficult. Running a hotline and having an in-person election protection staff in each state is really difficult to do remotely when you don't have any office space, when you and when you also when voters aren't actually going out to poll sites or to get out the vote events. And so that has required a lot of adjustment, and we're still in the process of making those adjustments, and we're still trying to troubleshoot and figure out how to do that work effectively. And I don't think I have like a solid answer at this point on exactly how this will look in the next month, 2 months, and 6 months. But I can just say that this has been an incredibly disruptive time, and it's something that affects just about every aspect of the voting rights world.
Can you talk about Wisconsin, what happened there, and the extent to which you think that's going to be replicated elsewhere?
Yeah, sure. So, I think a host of states, as folks know, postponed primaries that were scheduled in late March and in April. But Wisconsin was one of the states that did not. And things were sort of set to go forward for April 7th. Although there was some conversation about what exactly the election would look like. I think, and as we know, in retrospect, a lot of poll sites were closed all across the state because election administrators simply didn't have the poll workers or the resources available to be able to provide the same level of in-person voting that they did, that they originally planned to provide. And then similarly, there are certain barriers to obtaining an absentee ballot in Wisconsin that that were the subject of litigation, right? And I think everyone on this call is generally aware of this, but in Wisconsin, it was the case that under state law, in order for an absentee ballot to be considered viable or valid, a voter had to submit it 3 days on the Friday before the election, and it had to be received by the election board on election day. That was the subject of litigation at a district court level, and ultimately there was a district court order that pushed the date by which individuals had to submit their absentee ballot by a week, several days, till a week after the election, and that was then appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, which issued a stay on that injunction. Basically, what ultimately came to pass was that any voter that had requested an absentee ballot and received it could submit their absentee ballot by election day, and it would, assuming it was received by their election authority, it would count. But no extension beyond that was permitted. And the Supreme Court's reasoning was really about making decisions that affect election rules in the days leading up to an election, and not having a disruptive effect on election procedures in that way. That's, I think that that has implications for the way that litigators like myself will do the work going forward. It poses some significant challenges. Oftentimes you don't know, for instance, whether a voter has the potential for being disenfranchised until a few days before the election. So for instance, in this particular case, it would have been impossible for the plaintiffs in the case to know whether, how many voters would have not received their absentee ballots that they applied for in a timely manner, in a manner which they could then submit by election day. And it turned out that the number of voters was in the tens of thousands. So, this ruling does this ruling will present a significant challenge in upcoming elections and in November, because it really restricts the ability for folks to seek relief on an emergency basis in the days before an election.
And if we look, we've been talking for a long time about voter suppression and the way that's occurred around the country. If you look at the key states that we worry about in terms of November, can you talk a bit about what it looks like, say, in Florida or Ohio or Pennsylvania or those other states?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to say there's a hard and fast rule that certain states are going to be, that there's a principle by which you can determine which states are going to be problematic. I think what you can generally do is take a look at what laws are on the books for how absentee ballots are applied for and how they're submitted, right? So in some states, there are requirements that in order to obtain an absentee ballot, you need a valid excuse to obtain one. And it's not clear that the COVID-19 situation and social distance and compliance with social distancing guidelines would comply with as a valid excuse in all cases. So there's, those are states that we'll have to generally keep an eye on for and see if there's any efforts to expand eligibility for absentee ballots. There are restrictions in certain states that require a voter to have a witness sign their absentee ballot, which, as you can imagine, or get a notary, get their absentee envelope notarized. As you can imagine, and again, in the age of social distancing, that can present a very difficult burden for voters. And then obviously what was at issue in Wisconsin in terms of the submission deadline for providing an absentee ballot and how those are submitted, and how much we can trust and work with the U.S. Postal Service. These are all things that I think are going to be issues that will have different implications in each state. And each state's particular cocktail of rules will basically determine how much attention they receive.
And I assume you are studying the disproportionate impact upon communities of color, state by state, right? Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. So, I think there's generally the conventional wisdom is that a lot of communities of color generally do not rely on vote by mail. And so this is going to present, to the extent that that's true, it's going to present a real challenge here because I think a lot of folks who are in communities of color will be learning how to work this process for the first time, which can present barriers in itself. And, I think there are reasons why communities of color in certain states have chosen not to rely on this particular system. There are, there's a lack of trust in some of the apparatuses that are required to operate an efficient absentee ballot system, which, for instance, we know in Georgia, in cases that we've litigated, Black communities in Georgia often have very little faith that their ballots, if they were mailed in, will be counted. And so bridging these trust gaps and making sure that voters can have the trust in the institutions to be able to do this type of, to vote this way, I think is going to be a really important part of making sure that turnout doesn't fall dramatically in these communities.
So let me just ask you about grassroots participation and making these things happen so that we have, if we can assure sort of more robust system of voting. To what extent, I know you're working with grassroots groups, can people help at a distance like this?
I think that's challenging, right? I mean, and I think that's the central challenge that a lot of our partners are facing right now. I think that ultimately this is something that we're still trying to figure out, right? I don't know. I don't know how to run an effective get out the vote operation in a situation where everyone's sort of relying on Zoom to connect with one another, where you're trying to reach out to communities that often don't have internet access or the access to internet that would allow for this type of interaction. So that is a central challenge. I know that there are a lot of folks who sort of specialize in that world who are sort of thinking this problem through and trying to figure out ways to do this. But I think that some part of this is going to really be dependent on the ways that the world looks once the shelter-in-place orders are relaxed, and when we can, start to move out of our houses and our apartments, and we can start to think a little bit more about how to organize in an era where we still have to socially distance, but we still want to be able to engage in these types of communal activities.
And you've seen enhanced voter suppression, I assume, during this last month, right? Techniques to do that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's interesting, right? I think you see situations where I think the Wisconsin situation is one which I don't know how else to describe it besides voter suppression, where tens of thousands of people simply did not receive their ballots um, in a manner where they would be able to vote, and were effectively disenfranchised. Where in Milwaukee, we saw 180 poll sites boiled down to just 5, and you saw those lines. Those lines. The video of those lines is incredibly powerful, and it's something that I think should last with us as we start to think about how to run elections in the next coming months. But I also think that there have been efforts in other places where you would expect, where we tend to do a lot of our work to fight voter suppression, which suggest, that there is some effort to try to make sure that people can vote, right? So I think a lot of states are currently, Georgia included, are sending out applications for absentee ballots to every registered voter. Georgia is a state that we do a lot of work in on voter suppression issues. That's not to say that that it's not problematic and that there weren't issues with the way that those applications were sent out, but it's just to say that the way that this is going to play out, I think, is going to be very nuanced and specific to each state and its particular circumstances.
So before I turn to Dari Ali, I'm going to ask you what many people ask, a $64,000 question. So there's some speculation that President Trump, who apparently announced today he was going to call off Congress, it may call off the November election and postpone them. Do you have any view on that?
I don't see that as a possibility. I mean, I think I'm hopeful that that's not realistic, and I don't think that there's very strong legal authority for that type of move. I think the bigger danger and the thing that we should all be concerned about is ensuring that people can effectively cast their ballots in November. And I think you don't have to push an election to disenfranchise millions of people. And look, I mean, I think Wisconsin was an example of that. You can hold an election in a way and in a manner that's not particularly accessible in a moment of a public health emergency and disenfranchise tens of thousands of voters. And I think that's a more realistic scenario for what we're looking at in November. And that's what I think we should be planning to try to protect against.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm not sure that's very optimistic, but at least it will inspire people to learn more and maybe ask some questions as we go forward. So, Dari Ali, let's turn to healthcare, health equity, and employment. Those are the two areas where you oversee a wide range of areas, but those are the two that you are focusing on the most. So, can you talk to us about health equity and how the focus on that has shifted and changed?
Sure.
Thank you for being here as well.
Thanks for having me. It's really exciting to be a part of this very important program. And thanks to the Freedman Institute for hosting this. Thanks to Hofstra Law, my alma mater. And I wanted to give a shout out to LALSA, BALSA, and the other affinity groups. When I was at Hofstra, I was president of LALSA, and LALSA and BALSA were a big part of my time at Hofstra Law. So thank you for all of the great work that the students are doing. I know that this is a very hard time for students, for folks in New York. Ajay is back in New York, but I was in New York a long time before moving to DC, and I've been keeping close track of all of the developments that are happening in New York. So my thoughts are with all of you, and hoping that everybody is safe and healthy. So I've been at the Lawyers Committee for about almost 5 years now, actually. And when I joined the Lawyers Committee, I took over what used to be the Employment Discrimination Project. And our executive director, Kristen Clark, repurposed the project so that it would more broadly focus on economic inequality and economic justice. But I had a lot of authority in deciding what the priorities would be. And I decided that we would continue to focus on employment discrimination and increasing employment opportunities for communities of color, with a particular focus on increasing opportunities for people with criminal records, but also that it was important to focus on the intersection of race and gender, to focus on the intersection of race and LGBTQ issues, and to do that work not only in the employment space, but also in the health space. Health, access to healthcare is a critical civil right. And I think it's an area where a lot of racial justice organizations like ours have historically not done a whole lot of work around. So I thought it was important for us to prioritize that as an issue area. So over the past few years, we've been building a body of work related to health equity with a focus on increasing access to reproductive care, contraception, abortion, and with a focus on women of color and communities of color. We always have a very full appellate docket. We always file a lot of briefs at the Supreme Court level. Obviously, being a civil rights attorney under this administration has been, we've been incredibly busy. A lot of civil rights and constitutional rights have been under attack. And with the change in the composition of the Supreme Court and other courts throughout the country, we're just seeing a lot more litigation to attack civil rights and constitutional rights. So there has been no shortage of work for my project. Last year, we weighed in by way of amicus in various Supreme Court cases, including the Title VII LGBTQ case, the DACA case, the June medical case, which involves a law in Louisiana limiting access to abortion. And so we have been busy sort of on all fronts, ensuring that the attacks to civil rights are blunted and that we are preserving the existing rights that our communities have. It's been a combination of litigation, but also work at the administrative level. We've been filing a lot of comments with various agencies like the Department of Labor, the EEOC, the CFPB, as many of these rollbacks have happened. So I think it's important to kind of like lay the groundwork of what was happening before this pandemic happened. And what COVID has done is really lay bare this stark racial disparities that exist in our country. And as civil rights attorneys, we had to just hit pause and kind of pivot and take a look at the work that we were doing and figure out how we could effectively respond to the racial disparities that were being laid bare by the pandemic. And so for my project in particular, we realized that we had to focus on the impact that the pandemic was having on communities of color, not only from a health perspective, but also from an employment perspective. And quite frankly, on a personal level, that required us to kind of just emotionally and mentally pivot. Because I'm sure, as all of you remember, that first week when we were working from home, it was an adjustment, right? It was an adjustment. I have two small children in pre-K and first grade, getting used to doing the remote learning, plus working from home, and also just grappling with the impact that the pandemic was having, quite frankly, on the communities that we are a part of. And so it's required us to think about how to be present and how to engage in rapid response tactics to ensure that we are adequately addressing the needs of the communities that we serve. So from a healthcare perspective, we have mainly been focused on pushing for the federal government and states to release race and ethnicity data for COVID tests, cases, and outcomes. And last week, on Monday, it feels like it was months ago, but last Monday, we issued a letter to HHS, we issued a FOIA request to CDC, and we issued letters to all 50 state departments asking that they release the data. The reason that we did that was because we, the week before, we had come across an article in, I believe it was BuzzFeed, discussing the effort of a small group of doctors of color who were really sounding the alarm and asking the administration to release that information. It just so turned out that a couple of those doctors were good friends of a colleague of mine. So we reached out to them and said, look, what can we do to amplify this ask? And they thought it would be powerful if we drafted a letter to HHS and noted the civil rights obligations that healthcare entities have to prohibit discrimination, and to just make clear that structural racism is something that has always existed in our society, that bias in the healthcare system limits the type of care that people of color receive, that it impacts the health outcomes that they experience, and that the same continues to be true during this pandemic. People of color are more likely to work in low-wage jobs that are less likely to have insurance coverage, less likely to have paid leave, and those are additional barriers that make it difficult for people of color to access testing and to access the healthcare that they need if they become sick with COVID. The other point that we made in the letter is that people of color are more likely to have underlying comorbidities that make them more susceptible to complications should they get COVID. And so we drafted this letter, and we were able to get close to 400 medical professionals to sign on to the letter. And it garnered a lot of interest from the public. That same week, a couple of days after we issued the letter, the CDC issued limited data. They issued data for about 14 states for the month of March. And not surprisingly, that data corroborates what we already know, that African Americans and other communities of color are being hit incredibly hard by this pandemic. And so collecting the data is one piece, but there has to be another piece, right? It has to be complemented with policy efforts. And so in the past week, since issuing the letter, we've been having a lot of conversations with coalition partners to really explore what we can do collectively to push the administration to do the right thing, to equitably distribute resources in the communities that need it the most, to ensure that access to fast and free testing is available. And we are thinking about what we can do at the state level too to support the actors on the ground that are pushing for similar policy changes. And you know, all of this is happening in real time. Every single day there are new developments, and we are finding that there's power in numbers. There's a real benefit to collaborating with other groups, to collaborating with medical professionals, quite frankly, to learn from them as to what the best response might be, and to just remain like nimble and flexible as this continues, but also to ensure that we're taking care of ourselves. Self-care is a priority for me and for my team. We regularly check in with each other. Of course, you know, we're starting to see that more people are being impacted by the pandemic. Some of us know people who have gotten COVID or who have passed from it. So I think it's very important that we engage in self-care and we recognize that this is totally unprecedented. And we just have to maintain a high level of communication and care for one another.
So can I ask you, a lot of this information is new to people, because even though we read about coronavirus and hear about it ad nauseum, we don't necessarily know about the work that you've done with other people. So how can, if people here want to help, or we want to get the word out there to assist your efforts, what do you recommend? I know you're all so busy that to create yet another vehicle to communicate with us is very difficult.
So we did create, because we received that request from others outside of the medical community who were interested in signing on to support the demand that the CDC and other federal agencies release the data. So we did create a petition, and happy to send you that link. I don't have it at my fingertips, but we did create a petition for people to sign on online. That's one way. And at the state and local level, right? If you live in New York, I think it's important to push health officials to not only release comprehensive data, but to ensure that they are collecting complete and robust data. One thing that we've been seeing is that there are a lot of unknowns in the data that's being reported. So you'll have race and ethnicity demographic information that's being released, but then a large percentage of that will be unknown. So there has to be improvements in how the data is collected to ensure that the data is as complete as possible.
And with the data, I assume litigation's not on the horizon at the moment, right? That there's so much going on right now that advocacy takes other forms.
So right now we are focusing on advocacy. We issued the letters last week, and the states are starting to respond. The responses have been trickling in, and many of them have said, you know, thank you for alerting us to this issue. The information is now available on our website. At the federal level, we did issue a FOIA request, and we are awaiting to see if we get a response. You know, with FOIA, the litigation is always an option. But right now, we're waiting to see what sort of response we get, both from states and the federal level.
Right. So I'm going to turn to employment. Can you talk about the work that you were doing and the work you're doing now?
Yeah, so the work that we were doing was, as I mentioned, we were doing a lot of work on behalf of people with criminal records. In Pennsylvania, we're engaged in litigation against SEPTA, the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transit Authority, on behalf of people with criminal records who were denied employment opportunities because of a very, very rigid employment policy that they have. And that litigation is ongoing. We've also been doing work related to workplace harassment and pay equity, with a focus on women of color and communities of color. And as I mentioned, we had also filed the amicus brief in the Title VII LGBTQ case before the Supreme Court, which is still pending, and we're awaiting a ruling, to just highlight the impact of workplace discrimination on LGBTQ people of color in particular, and the increased rates of harassment and discrimination that that population is subjected to. Since the pandemic hit, we have been really concerned about a few issues on the employment front. First, the staggering unemployment numbers. I think the latest figure is that about 22 million people have filed for unemployment. It's staggering. And we know that the communities that are being hit the hardest in terms of job loss are communities of color, are African Americans and Latinos. And so we've been doing a lot of thinking about what does it mean to have economic security during these times? We're talking about sort of a double whammy, right? Communities of color being hard from the health perspective, but also from an economic perspective. And as I mentioned earlier, the communities that we serve are less likely to be able to work from home, more likely to be in the low wage positions that are at the front lines of this pandemic, and less likely to have benefits like healthcare, health insurance, paid leave. So all of these factors create grave risks for the communities that we serve. And so one thing that we've been doing is responding to the Department of Labor's decision at the federal level to suspend affirmative action obligations for federal contractors that are responding to COVID. Federal contractors, businesses that engage or do business with the federal government, have to comply with diversity and affirmative action obligations that require them to do targeted outreach to underrepresented communities, among other obligations. And under this administration, well, under the current Department of Labor, they issued a national interest exemption, basically allowing new contractors to forego complying with those obligations. And we think that that is problematic because given the high numbers of unemployment, given the high rates of job loss, we know that very few businesses will actually be hiring in this time and in the months to follow. So to the extent that there are businesses that are receiving stimulus money from the federal government and will be hiring, it's very important for those limited employment opportunities to be targeted at the communities that are being hit the hardest from an economic standpoint. So we've been doing advocacy on that front. We've been doing advocacy to see if we can get the EEOC to toll the deadlines by which individual claimants have to file their charges. We know that if there are people who are experiencing discrimination in the workplace, they may not have the ability to go and file a charge with the EEOC. The EEOC did announce that it is suspending the right to sue notices. So that's a step in the right direction, but we're continuing to do work on that front. And then the last point I'll share is that we're also very concerned about safety issues, particularly for Black and Brown and other workers in factories. There have been a lot of reports about workers in poultry factories, for example, where workers have contracted COVID, and it appears that employers are not doing enough to keep their workers safe. So those are some of the issues that are on our radar.
Are you working on the issues regarding nursing homes and other places where medical workers, there's another story this morning, medical worker asked for a mask and said she wouldn't work without a mask and she got fired?
Yeah, we're definitely aware of those issues, and we have been communicating our list of priorities to the Hill. And among those priorities was to ensure that frontline workers have access to the PPE that they need. It's critically important. And obviously without that equipment, they're not able to do the job that they need to do. And I think that that issue also applies to other essential workers who are working in stores, working in factories. It's critically important that they have the protective equipment that they need in order to be able to do their job safely.
So you've been brainstorming not only internally, but with other organizations. How large is the coalition of people working together on any of these issues? And is there a way in which people on this call, for instance, we could access some of that to help?
So we are a part of a broader civil rights coalition. There's an organization called the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and they convene all of the different civil rights groups. So we are in constant communication with them and other groups that make up that coalition. I believe the coalition has a couple of hundred groups that are members of that coalition. But in any given day, I mean, we're in touch with, I feel like last week I was having a conversation with a different group every single day. And those are relationships that existed prior to this pandemic, but we are leaning heavily on one another just because, of course, resources are limited, and there is real value in pulling together collective brain trust to figure out how to respond to these very novel and unprecedented issues.
And can you talk a little about unemployment insurance? Daily, we hear reports of how systems are so broken around the country so that people can't even access the computer base to apply for unemployment.
Yeah, that's right. There have been a lot of reports about the difficulties that people are having in accessing the system, reports that people have tried to file 1,000 times. You see long lines in certain states by workers trying to file claims at their local unemployment insurance offices. And I think that it's a sort of a common thread with the stimulus packages that we're seeing, that it appears that unfortunately there isn't a lot of coordination or thought into how these processes and structures will be set up so as to ensure ease in securing the benefits.
So the question is, there's very little attention except on places like Trevor Noah and Stephen Colbert about the way other countries, the way Canada and the way European countries are dealing with this, which is so much more successful. Apparently in Canada, each person is entitled to $2,000 a month. They've already gotten their checks. There's a system in place that works well, right? In Europe, we know that employers are paid by the government to keep employees on their payroll, so they don't have the kinds of problems that we do. And I don't see much of that kind of focus when we talk about these issues in our country. To what extent is that part of the advocacy?
That's certainly, so the underlying economic justice issues that you're discussing that are more prevalent in other countries perhaps are issues that we have been doing a lot of advocacy around. Paid leave, for example, is an issue that we've been doing a lot of advocacy around to ensure that workers have access to the necessary paid leave that they have to either take care of themselves or a loved one should they become ill with the pandemic. No worker should have to choose between going to their job or taking care of a loved one. The first few COVID packages really focused on pumping money into our economy and into businesses. And we've really focused on ensuring that we are advocating for the rights of individuals, for the rights of families, for the rights of workers, because it's not enough to expect that that stimulus will trickle down to the communities that we serve. Those priorities really have to be front and center.
So one of the questions we've gotten is how you think COVID will impact employees' rights to reasonable accommodations moving forward, now that work from home is a widely available option for some, where others are considered essential and frontline workers.
So, well, the reasonable accommodation question is an interesting one because I think we've been thinking about it in the context of individuals with underlying health issues who may be exposed by going into work, and if there's a risk of contracting COVID. So that's an area where we are starting to do some research and bring ourselves up to speed because it is an important issue, particularly for marginalized workers working in conditions where they may not have safe workplaces. But I think in that question too, I'm hearing, will this change how we work? And I'm hopeful that it will. I think what we have learned is that, quite frankly, we've been working more than ever. We are working around the clock, and there's no doubt that, just because we're at home doesn't mean that we're not being productive. If anything, we're probably being even more productive. Not to say that it's a good thing to work around the clock, but we have found ways to work effectively even though we are working from home. So hopefully it will result in employers being more comfortable with utilizing flexible work arrangements.
They're doing a daunting amount of work. I'm taking quick questions now. So one of the questions, AJ, is do you think there are ways in which people who are sick with COVID or other illnesses or caring for people who are sick might significantly struggle to get the opportunity to vote?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we've already seen that. I remember right at the beginning of March, there were a few primaries in Arizona, Florida, and Michigan. And I was on the phones with quite a few other folks at our organization helping out on election protection issues. And I received a number of calls from voters in Florida who were self-quarantining because they had been exposed to COVID-19 and had no ability to access an emergency absentee ballot under the existing rules in Florida. I think this is a significant issue. And it'll vary state by state. But if you find out that you have been, once we move past the shelter in place, if and when we move past the shelter in place stage of this crisis, and when we move into the stage of voters having to isolate when they've been exposed to COVID-19, if you end up having to isolate in the days before an election and you miss the deadline for applying for an absentee ballot, you potentially are disenfranchised. And I think this is a very real issue that, again, on a state-by-state basis, we're going to have to try to figure out how to deal with.
This isn't related, but it's another voting rights question. What's your views on the Klobuchar proposal for voting by mail? Can it pass? So why don't you first explain what that is and then tell us what you think?
Sure. So, there are a couple of different proposals in Congress right now that would require at the federal level, in federal elections, that states provide easy open access to vote by mail. There are a lot of details in these various plans, but what they effectively would do would be to preempt some of the state level barriers that we see again, on a state-by-state basis, to obtaining access or accessing a vote by mail, accessing an absentee ballot. In some of the proposals that we see, they go even further and suggest, moving to a predominantly or entirely vote by mail system on the scale of what is available in Washington or in Oregon, as I had mentioned earlier on this webinar. What I'll say about those is, I think they recognize I think it's a recognition of the moment we're in, a recognition that voting is going to look different. In every election, starting in March through all the way through November, it's just not going to be the way that we planned it to be a year ago at this time. And vote by mail is going to play a more significant role, whether, regardless of what the restrictions are in a particular jurisdiction. I think you can see that in Wisconsin, where there were 3 to 4 times the amount of absentee ballots submitted as was typically, as was expected, and as was the rate in previous elections. So I think these recognize that reality. I think what needs to happen simultaneous to that, however, is a recognition that it is extremely difficult for election administrators to go from a predominantly in-person voting system and transition from that to an entirely vote by mail system in the matter of months. It took several years for many of the states that have predominantly vote by mail systems to implement those systems. And so our expectations need to be realistic, while at the same time recognizing the importance of making this particular way of casting a ballot more accessible.
So a related question is from somebody who asks your views on executive orders as a way to change election laws. For instance, Cuomo changed unilaterally in New York the rules related to candidate signature requirements and deadlines, as well as a primary date and absentee ballot qualifications. I mean, obviously the use of executive order can be problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suspect that, so just a little bit of background on that, I think emergency powers vary state by state. Some governors, and I believe New York is among them, have the ability to suspend specific statutes, regulations, and rules through executive authority during an emergency. Other states do not provide that same level of authority. Some states provide governors and secretaries of state the ability to unilaterally delay an election or postpone an election, and we've seen that power used over the last month with respect to a lot of these primaries that we were originally expecting to see in April. I think I suspect that the use of that power to delay or postpone an election, it can be the subject of litigation. I'm not sure if it will be in New York, but I do think that when it comes to some of the deadlines and some of the other rules, I suspect that there will be litigation around this particular issue. And for instance, in New York, it is the case that in New York, you are required to provide an excuse in order to obtain an absentee ballot. And that is actually written in the New York State Constitution. It's not just in statute. And so it's, I think, an open question about whether the governor has the authority to do that. And it will likely be something that will get litigated.
Well, when you say likely to get litigated, one of the questions is most of the courts are closed, right? We have emergency courts that are open in certain places. Maybe the courts will begin to open, but what does it mean to say we're going to litigate things now or then in any of these areas, given the current lack of ability to do so? Dari Ali, what do you have to say about this one?
Well, Jay's answer may be different than mine, because I know that the voting rights team has been litigating, and you have seen a lot of litigation in other areas like abortion, right, with various states deeming abortion to not be essential care. And there has been a lot of litigation filed in various states on that point. From our perspective, we are engaging in other tactics, including policy advocacy, outreach, direct outreach to relevant agencies. And thinking about litigation should those other efforts not prove to be fruitful. So I'll let Ajay speak to that too, because I know that they have been busy on the litigation front.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we've filed quite a few cases over the last month, mostly in federal court, mostly seeking emergency relief. And, again, as I mentioned earlier, with the decision at the Supreme Court in the Wisconsin case, the bar for arguing that you're entitled to relief in those cases has become a lot more difficult. But just logistically, I think it has also really affected the ability to litigate these cases. You're in these cases, we're no longer appearing in court to argue a motion for a preliminary injunction or a TRO. Sometimes that's occurring by Zoom. Sometimes the court is simply just deciding that it's not necessary and they'll just make a decision on the papers. And so, I think that it requires an adjustment on our end on the way that we litigate and how we structure our initial papers to make sure that we're adding everything that we want to make sure is in the case, and making sure that we're making the best case we can, because we may not have a second chance to argue before the judge.
To what extent are the courts open? I think people don't fully know that. And it depends, state by state, obviously it depends, but how about the federal courts?
I think that they're open for a sort of reduced level of business at this point. And again, so far, we haven't had any issues filing the emergency actions that we filed. But in the ongoing cases that we have, which, involve discovery and other, dispositive motion practice, those have generally been delayed. We were experiencing delays and postponements on those. So, I think there is definitely far more limited access to the courts than there was a month ago. But, given the kind of character of emergency relief we're seeking, we've still been able to litigate those cases.
Another question has to do with the post office, which we know is under threat. The diminution of the post office's ability, how is that going to affect voting by mail?
I think it affects it pretty significantly. I mean, this is an issue in my other general area of work at the Lawyers Committee and at the AG's office in the census, that I've also been very sensitive to as well. The inability, to the extent that the post office is not operating at full capacity, to the extent that the post office is not operating efficiently, it can affect an ability of a voter to receive their materials on time, to submit their materials in a timely manner. I mean, the timing of all of this is incredibly important in the absentee application process and absentee ballot voting process. And so even slight inefficiencies in the postal system can have pretty profound effects on disenfranchisement.
Is you or anyone else collecting data about the extent to which this is occurring?
I know that there's a lot of folks who are looking very closely at the way this operated in Wisconsin specifically, and how the post office, certain issues with the post office resulted in tens of thousands of ballots not being cast the way that they should have been cast and received in a way that they should have been received, and thereby disenfranchising tens of thousands of voters. So this is something that we're all keeping an eye on and certainly, documenting to make sure that we have a strong record in front of us whenever we are ultimately going to seek relief from in a particular court.
Thank you. Another question is whether your office or anyone else has been monitoring voting rights cases across the country as to the use of technology to do depositions and arguing motions, and if so, what are you seeing?
I have not been monitoring that, and I don't know that I'm not quite sure of other folks in our office have seen that. I don't know, Dari Ali, if you've heard of anything like that yet. I mean, I've heard from other folks outside of the voting world that they've conducted a video deposition at this point. It strikes me as a very difficult thing to do, but again, I haven't, in the voting world itself, I don't know that anyone is tracking that.
Dari Ali, do you know?
No, the same, but I did see that question came from Mr. Frederick Brewington, who was our co-counsel in the Garden City housing discrimination case. I just wanted to say hello.
Yes, it did come from him. And he's also on our board. We're really very pleased, Mr. Brewington, that you have joined us. Oh, Fred, he's just said that they have it going on in the iSlip case, that they are doing that in the iSlip case. So I'm wondering, as I think about this, Obama and Eric Holder are spending a great deal of time on voting rights issues. Do you have any idea what it is they're doing and whether they're responsible for monitoring or part of the leadership conference?
Look, there are a lot of different groups right now. The voting world there's always room for more folks to get involved and to ensure ballot access for underserved communities. That said, I mean, there are a lot of different players in this community as well. I do know that, I know that Eric Holder's group was involved in the census litigation, and they are involved on redistricting issues. And I think they're looking very carefully at some of the delays in the census and what those delays could potentially mean for redistricting in the coming year. And that's something that we're also keeping an eye on. I think that from a redistricting perspective, the way that the census operates and the accuracy of the census is going to have a tremendous impact ultimately on how whether particular communities see their right to vote diminished in any way based on faulty numbers.
And you were doing a great deal of census work long before this started, right?
I was, yes.
So
yeah.
What's happening with that work? I can't imagine the amount of work you're doing is stunning. It's really astounding.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's important for folks to know that generally that the self-response stage of the census is open. And if you have not already responded to the census, please do so. Last I checked, I think New York has a pretty low response rate among states in the country, which, isn't unexpected, but it is something that, folks who receive census materials or folks can address by responding to the census now. As far as in-field operations, what's called non-response follow-up, when enumerators go out in the field and knock on doors and try to count individuals, that is all suspended, and it has been suspended. It was supposed to begin in early May. It has been suspended until June. And the latest news is that the administration has sought to extend deadlines for providing final census counts for what's called apportionment, which is distributing the amount of Congress people to each state, as well as redistricting. So those delays could potentially have a real impact on redistricting at the state and local level next year and the year beyond and beyond.
Thank you. We have a question that Dari Ali's actually answered in the chat room, but I raised it for everybody about the Americans with Disabilities Act. So telework accommodations have been argued around for a long time in the context of the ADA, and often employers will claim that the telework accommodation is unduly burdensome, so that the employer denies it as unreasonable and it ends up before the EEOC. One would think the present situation undermines the linchpin of that defense and paradoxically greatly expands access to the workforce for workers with disabilities in general. You want to talk? Yeah, you said agreed. You want to talk a little more about that?
I think that's right. I mean, I think some industries, some fields are less comfortable with expanding access to teleworking and remote access. I think the legal field is one of those industries. And of course, not every job is amenable to a work from home arrangement, but many office jobs are. And even when they are, I think sometimes there's a resistance to allowing workers to take advantage of that. And, as we discussed before, I think that this pandemic is unprecedented in the sense that so many workers have had to pivot and work from home. My sister works in a museum in Florida, and even she's working from home, and she has plenty of work to keep her busy. So I agree. I think that sometimes the unduly burdensome defense is used to maybe too frequently or not when it's appropriate, and this pandemic has shown that oftentimes it is possible to work from home. But that being said, working from home is a privilege, and some jobs, right? If you're working in a poultry factory, you can't do that job from home. If you have to be a cashier at Target, you can't work from home. And there is data that shows that workers of color are much less likely to be able to work from home than their white counterparts, which again contributes to the increased risk that they will be more likely to be exposed to COVID.
Okay, we can take some more questions. We have a few more minutes left. I'm wondering if either of you have any parting thoughts other than this work is daunting, it's overwhelming. We can't all thank you enough for everything you're doing. I keep asking this question of how we can help those of us who are not on the front lines with you working directly. What is it we can do?
Ellen, as you said at the beginning, please go to our website, lawyerscommittee.org, to learn more about the organization. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @LawyersCom, to just keep apprised of the work that we're doing. And if you could amplify the work that we are doing, we would greatly appreciate it.
AJ?
Yeah, what I would just add to that. So in election protection world, and also in Get Out the Census world, Lawyers Committee makes available hotlines that put people who are experiencing issues in contact with volunteers who we train and who can answer and troubleshoot any issues that they're experiencing. So if anybody on the call is looking, has some time and is willing to volunteer some time to help staff those hotlines, we're always looking for volunteers, and you can go to our website and find out some more information about how to do that.
And we'll promote that to our students who, unfortunately have exams soon, but during the summer, many of them are looking for internships or work that they can do to be helpful. So this seems like a great opportunity. We have another question. First of all, a comment. So Susan Zesh, who's online, who's been an alumni of the Chicago Lawyers for Civil Rights for many years, now teaching, says, "My hat's off to the valiant frontline lawyers," and we all agree with that. This is pretty remarkable work. So before we and here's the last question. There's a real problem with people working at home, the opposite problem, because employers are asking employees to provide working conditions, to provide their own computers, all their own stuff, and other facilities that they don't have. Does an employer have an obligation to accommodate employees who can do their jobs at work, but they can't do it at home?
If the equipment is necessary to perform the job, I would say yes. I think Jay and I are very lucky to work for an organization that has been very accommodating and has gone out of their way to make sure that we have what we need in order to do our jobs well from home. This issue is coming up too in the education context, and education is a whole nother issue that we really didn't get into, but with remote learning, obviously, there are issues with accessing internet for different communities. And what does it mean when you are switching to an online remote learning model and you have students from marginalized communities who don't have that access? And what does equity look like from that perspective? I know that a lot of communities have been delivering laptops to students so that they have the equipment that they need. But access to broadband, access to the internet, those are other civil rights issues that are top of mind for our education folks at the Lawyers Committee.
And we can do a separate program just on education. For people who don't know, in New York, our state, there's going to be significant cutbacks in education and in healthcare. Those are the two areas that are really going to suffer. And the people now in the education field are trying to figure out how it is possible for them to be able to educate our students going forward, most of whom, the majority, are just students of color. So we could do another program on education, but in the meantime, we want to thank you very much for taking the time out there. This is fascinating, disturbing, interesting. Thank you so much for being on the front lines, and hopefully people on this call, particularly students, we can figure out a way over the summer that we can develop some internships so that we can help you in your work. So everybody, thank you, stay safe, and see you all soon again.